Good morning. Happy Wednesday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. Okay. So Wednesday, that means tomorrow's Chips and Salsa Day. Also, 6 a.m. Coffee and Coaches Conference call. So if you haven't participated in one of those yet, please do. We always have a good group of people to get on there, have a little coffee, relax, blow off some steam, get some questions answered, so it's kind of fun. So I do recommend that. Mike Robertson is on today for iFastU for the Q&A call there. So if you're a member of iFastU, be ready for that. That should be really fun and interesting as well. Okay, and I have a pretty cool question for today. A little off the beaten path, not really going to be like one of those typical, oh, do this and then this kind of a questions. So it's a little bit more of a reasoning type of question, but it's still very, very useful and very, very interesting. And this comes from Marcel. Marcel says, I've been implementing your model with some good success, but there seems to be a variation in how much of the changes we get to stick. Some clients, things change very, very nicely and stay that way, and others seem like an ongoing battle to maintain good movement variability. Can you talk about what factors influence things not sticking and how to go about working out what the client needs if it is hard to maintain changes? Well, Marcel, welcome to my world. Okay, so this is not weird, it's not unusual. There are always people that change very readily, and you may never see them again after that first visit because they do so well. And then there's the people that are much more challenging, and that's just, you know, the broad scope variation of how humans have so many potential influences. So let's look at this from a broad perspective for a second. So there are always things that we can know, and there's things that we don't know. When we talk about things being multifactorial, we don't even know how many things potentially influence. But let's look at the human as a broad system that's made up of subsystems. And let's say that you have 12 subsystems in your body, and one of those lacks sufficient adaptability and then promotes a deficit in movement, which can ultimately result in pain, and they come to see guys like you and me. And let's say that we do an intervention, and that intervention addresses that subsystem that is the limiting factor, and then they have a great outcome and everything goes really, really well. They learn how to maintain their adaptability and they feel great. But now let's say that there's multiple subsystems that could be involved. So let's say that we've got 2 or 3 out of these 12, and let's say that our intervention covers 8 of those, but unfortunately the 2 or 3 that are low in adaptability are not affected at all. Now we don't make the change. And so those are the things that we have to understand, is that this is why we never really know why people get better or why they don't get better. Because there's so many potential influences. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to influence as many of those subsystems as possible with treatment and training to produce the desired outcome. So there's always that factor in play. The adaptations that we often utilize on the rehab end of things, before we get to sort of like the fitness and the conditioning and reconditioning elements, they tend to be learning-based adaptations. So some people learn faster than others. Some people have more perceptual capabilities. Some people learn have a broader experience to draw on, so they do adapt faster. Some people are better trained. So again, we have these genetic influences, we have these cognitive influences, we have psychological influences that all determine what type of progress we're going to make with people. And so again, we have to take all of those things into consideration. When it comes to things like training, personal behaviors, habits, etc. So now we have potential interference problems. So if I am training to produce high force, high strength, hypertrophy, etc., and I have these really strong concentric orientation elements that influence the way that I move or can't move, then we have actually an interference with training. So sometimes you got to take certain things away from people for a while so they can become more adaptable. Some people have unknown stressors, or they don't perceive them as stress. So maybe it's a job, maybe it's a lack of sleep, maybe it's a relationship. All of those things can potentially influence our outcomes, because it does influence the system at some level, and then that produces what you and I would measure on the table. So thankfully, we've got a really good proxy measure for the fact that there is some sort of influence that is affecting our patient or our client. We also have to consider structural adaptations and sensory adaptations that become influential. So if I have somebody that has a true structural change, many times we can overcome those if they're small and they don't influence our ability to shift volumes and pressures. But if we have something like, say, a shoulder labrum or a hip labrum injury that's extensive enough, we no longer have that intact mechanism of a synovial joint, and then we got to send it back to the doc and say, look, well, we gave this a shot, it didn't go well, here's what I think. And then we get help from that perspective as well. When we talk about the sensory influences, all of your sensory systems have adaptability built into them. And so if I have a lens in an eye that can't change shape enough, then I have potential visual problems. If I have perceptual problems that are associated with vision, that needs to be addressed as well. So now we look at our behavioral optometrist for some help there. If we have a sensory issue in our mouths or a physical deficit, so we have people with a really small, narrow palate, a narrow airway, all of those things influence our ability to breathe and move and be comfortable, and again, managing the way that we perceive that from a stress-related standpoint all become these influences. So there's a lot of stuff here that we have to take into consideration. It makes it very, very difficult because, again, a lot of these things are just unknowns, and we're doing this by processes of elimination. It's like, okay, so it appears this, it appears this, it appears this, and we start to take things away, or we say, look, at some point in time, we have to recognize that it is not within our scope to help this person. We may be able to identify that there is a problem, but it is beyond our scope, and so then we need to refer them to someone else that may be able to help. That might be their primary care physician to become the case manager to start to manage this thing, or if we can identify a specific deficit because of our training, then we can refer them to the appropriate professional. So there's a lot of things that are potential influences. The first goal, I would say, is you got to try to eliminate any interferences that are obvious. Again, this could be a training-related thing or just a personal behavior thing that we think is an influence, and we can usually manage those rather readily. But there are always going to be those unknowns. So that's what makes this a little bit more difficult than we would like. Sometimes it'd be great if everybody came in and made those changes on the first day, but sometimes it is a struggle. There are many influences, my friend. Hang in there. Hopefully this was helpful just to stimulate some thought process for you. Have a great Wednesday. Chips and salsa tomorrow. Coffee and coaches call in the morning at 6 a.m. and I will see you guys later.